Yo, my name is Jockey Prophet, and welcome back to the series where I break down and analyse the designs of the Devil May Cry series to see why they work or why they don't. And oh boy, what an interesting one this is going to be. I think Devil May Cry 3 has some of the highest highs we've seen so far in the series, but also some really dark depths in terms of just terrible enemy design. This is part 3 of this series currently. I've already gone through the designs of Devil May Cry 2 and 1, and there'll be a playlist for that in the description. So, without further messing around, let's have a little bit of a chat about the designs of DMC3, shall we? Now let's begin in the logical place by discussing the overall themes of Devil May Cry, and how well Devil May Cry 3's story explores those. Devil May Cry has always been a series centered around a moral binary between humans and demons, good and evil. The first game attempted to explore the overlaps between this binary through Trish learning to feel, and certain demons presenting honourable aspects despite the cowardice and arrogance of their master Mundus. However, that game had a lot of poor writing and quite a couple of tonal inconsistencies that I think severely hindered the exploration of these themes, at least in an explicit sense. Additionally, those themes aren't really complex, certainly not enough to build an entire story off of. Devil May Cry 3 takes that base idea of sort of humans versus demons as this moral binary between good and evil, and greatly expands upon it. So instead of now just having, we have the humans who are preyed upon and made into these evil parasitic constructs by the demons, and the demons who are these disgusting parasitic organisms that sort of take control over human desires, who claim to have ultimate power and yet can only really manifest in the human world by possessing existing things, or by possessing existing human constructs like divinity in the case of Mundus. And it introduces more emotive themes, like different responses to trauma, like how to deal with a member of your family that has done something so beyond despicable that you are forced into a position where you have to take a stand against them. What is the right way to rebel? What is the point of rebellion? That last point specifically is a really central theme of Devil May Cry 3, the proper use of power and the point of rebellion. And in order to properly explore these themes, Devil May Cry 3 has 4 main characters that the story pays equal attention to and communicates sort of differing ideas with. They're split into 2 main pairings based on their familial bond, with Dante and Vergil obviously representing the more demonic end of the spectrum, and Lady and Arkham representing humans. Dante and Vergil's dynamic is fundamentally about power and its proper use. Vergil is traumatized by the death of their mother, and as such obsessively seeks out higher and higher forms of strength, and seems to have no apparent end goal other than simply just accruing more power. Dante, by contrast, initially seems to reject his power and responsibility, as he is completely unable to use his devil form before the game's midsection, rejecting one side of himself, or at least being unable to communicate with it. And his story focuses around himself finding his purpose, and his themes and design mainly focus around rebellion. Lady's story has her climbing the tower to avenge her mother's murder at Arkham's hands. Their story is also about power to some degree, with the mostly powerless Lady chasing after the demonic sorcerer Arkham, who was literally empowered by his sacrifice of Lady's mother. However, their story is also about familial bonds and taking responsibility, an important lesson that Dante actually learns and applies to his rivalry with Vergil, becoming concerned less with defeating him for the sake of it and more with stopping him because he can't allow his brother to sully his father's legacy by undoing his sacrifice. Outside of their set pairings though, all 4 characters inhabit a kind of character square, where they're all sort of foils for each other. I don't really know a better literary term for that one, but yeah, character square. Anyway, that's kind of the overall picture of the character design, so moving on, let's talk about Dante. Now, Devil May Cry 2 had a real Dante problem, as I've already outlined in my review of that game's designs. His design isn't particularly bad per se, but it does really lack any defining thematic traits other than kind of just being slick and edgy. For lack of a better term, it's not really trying to do anything in terms of a more subtextual sense, which is the result of the absolutely fucked production process of that game, preventing the story characters and designs of that game from really having any core cohesive theme, resulting in several disparate designs just kind of doing whatever the designers thought was most efficient for the kind of look the game was going for, being more edgy. And yeah, some of these disparate designs did have some good elements, but they weren't anything majorly special either. Keen to learn from that and mop up Devil May Cry 2's failings, director Hideaki Utsuno completely flipped the script on DMC3's Dante. Now he was no longer a stoic, silent edgelord, but he was louder, even more of an asshole, and crucially, younger. Making Dante visually much younger seems like a relatively small decision on paper, but it drastically impacts the game in several key ways. Firstly, it completely distances Devil May Cry 3's Dante away from both DMC2 and DMC1's more self-serious and dark tone by introducing us to a more rebellious and much less mature Dante. Second, it invites intrigue from fans of the first. Wouldn't you want to know how Dante ended up how he was in Devil May Cry 1? And thirdly, and most importantly from a design perspective, it comes pre-baked in with a story we've all seen done 1,000 times. The coming of age narrative, rebellion and maturity. Another key binary that this game actually explores, both in its writing and its design work. The most notable design change is the opening of his coat and removal of the prominent buckles which originally denoted his hidden maturity. This Dante is all out, titties out, balls to the wall action, building on the sense of arrogance that the DMC1 design conveyed, as now not only is he fighting demons in his long, elegant coat that can trip him up, he's fighting demons with all of his vital organs completely exposed in said big elegant coat. It's an arrogance that translates wonderfully to his fight scenes in the game's cinematics, as he willingly, sometimes gleefully, gets impaled and stabbed through the arm, just to flex on an enemy for no greater reason. Generally, that's something that the fight choreography in this game is excellent at conveying. It's conveying just how much fun Dante seems to be having fighting all these demons. And that's a really important running aspect of his character. The coat being open also acts as this nice, neat little bit of visual storytelling that links it to Devil May Cry 1, as this game is all about Dante maturing and understanding his importance as a son of Sparta. So when he completes that arc, he transitions to the Devil May Cry 1 design at the end of the game, gaining that maturity deep down despite his outwardly flippant demeanor, which, as I've discussed in my review of Devil May Cry 1's designs, is indicated through those prominent buckles you can see underneath the coat. There are many more of these really fun little design details which work really well in contrast with the later DMC Dante designs to communicate his growth from this point. But I feel like I'll definitely get completely off track, and this will just become a Dante character design retrospective, which should really be its own thing. But suffice it to say, one of the reasons this design works so well is because so much attention was paid to really making this feel like a much younger and more arrogant Dante, whose transformation into the current Dante we should be extremely interested in. Beyond that though, his design just works so perfectly to communicate who this character is, even in a vacuum. The open, studded leather coat, unkempt long hair, black pants, and fingerless gloves all clearly communicate a character who is almost wholly defined by literal hallmark symbols of punk rock and rebellion, which effectively reinvents Dante's entire look from this kind of striking gothic sleek look to, well, a punk teenager effectively, while, as I said, keeping those thematic consistencies with the designs that have come before and after in place. But of course, Dante isn't only his drip. His weapons also communicate the themes of the game and the series really well, though some more subtly than others, as his main sword is literally called fucking Rebellion, if you didn't already get what the game was going for, and features a big old human torso on it just to show how metal Dante is on this game. Without even really needing to go into it that far, Rebellion is just an iconic weapon. And in a rare change, we actually have Devil May Cry 2 to thank for its inclusion in the series at all. Clearly it was an attempt to lean into the more ridiculous, campy side of DMC design and distance itself from the more restrained previous Dante's sword, Force Edge, R.I.P. Alistar. The rest of Dante's arsenal also includes some of the good old, say it with me now, heavy duality theming, with each weapon either having multiple segments or parts, or outright having an alternate mode to it. And similarly to Rebellion, all of their designs feel free to embrace the campy, batshit insane nature of Devil May Cry. Particularly Nevin's fucking electric guitar scythe that summons demonic bats to electrocute people. I mean, you don't really get much better than that. In summary, I could go on and on and on about how absolutely brilliant this design is in terms of completely reinventing a character from this gothic, sleek, edgy professional who still did have his arrogant, flamboyant show-off side, but was way more focused into sort of dealing with the demons as precisely as possible, to this fucking punk kid who just wants to enemy surf on people and turns a woman into an electric guitar. It's such an effective character change, and I wholeheartedly give this design an S tier, with little to no areas that I can actively criticize. I don't really even think I need to say it at this point, but Vergil is an absolutely amazing design, because he succeeds in being the coolest character in the entire series while being initially almost entirely defined through thematic conflict with his brother. His coat is a cool blue, reflecting his cold and dispassionate nature, versus Dante's bright red coat, symbolizing his passion, his fervor, his desire to fight. His hair is swept backwards, visually making him much sleeker, as well as creating this air of precision and seriousness around his character. He can't allow even a hair to be out of place and potentially distracting, as is shown by the fact he keeps slicking his fucking hair back in every cutscene he's in. Where Dante bears himself to the world in arrogance, Vergil actually does wear something beneath his coat, a strange, almost ribbed sort of jacket that makes it appear as if the jacket is actually restraining him and keeping him closed off from the world. There's also the fact that compared to Dante's broad and versatile rebellion, Vergil uses the Yamato, a barely ornamented katana. First, the lack of ornamentation versus Dante's fucking skull broadsword demonstrate the difference in level of seriousness between the two. Vergil isn't really a character defined by being a show-off, or at least he would like you to believe that he isn't, and therefore his katana is completely sleek, precise, and devoid of any kind of major ornamentation. Dante is willing to let his wildness and passion show through his weapons, but Vergil keeps restrained and economical. After all, what use is a cool skull on a sword if it doesn't grant you more power? The more interesting thing to note as a difference here is that while Dante's broadsword is very versatile, it can cut, it can chop, slice, thrust, you can surf on it. Vergil's blade can only really cut one way, as there's only one sharp edge to the blade. That edge is literally so sharp it can cut through dimensions. I gotta say, I think this is a wonderful presentation of who these characters are through their arsenal. Usually I kind of feel that details like weapon choice get really overlooked in terms of character analysis and general design. They're just sort of treated as, yeah, that's a cool thing that character has, but they're sort of incidental to their overall character. But here, Vergil's Yamato and its contrast with Rebellion alludes to Vergil's most important trait, his single-minded desire for more and more power that's made him incredibly strong, but also brittle, and easily broken if put through too much strain. Just like Yamato and himself were both broken by Mundus at the end of this game and reforged into Nilo Angelo. I think one of the most fascinating aspects of his character design though are the various ways in which it demonstrates just how similar he is to Dante, despite their perceived difference. The game makes it blatantly obvious during their first battle that when Vergil's hair is brought down like Dante's, they both look almost the exact same, as they are supposed to be twins after all. It's brilliant because it's placed within a very humanizing moment where Vergil actually attempts to explain himself to Dante. There's more aspects in Vergil's design like this. The inner lining of his coat is actually a reddish orange, suggesting that beneath his cold, distanced exterior lies the same passion that drives Dante. And actually, that is the essence of Vergil. The entire point of his character is that he's very similar to Dante, but the trauma of losing their parents at such a young age caused him to seek out greater and greater levels of power in order to correct for what he sees as past weakness, which relates to Devil May Cry 3's theme of taking responsibility, because he mistakenly believes that somehow acquiring power at any cost is the only valid way to actually take responsibility for anything. What he fails to understand though is that power without purpose is fundamentally meaningless, and that his lack of purpose is what leads to his eventual defeats by both Dante and Mundus. It's a fascinating exploration of trauma and what kind of person it can create, especially when contrasted with both his own brother and Lady, who react to similar circumstances in various ways. He's also a really good foil for Arkham, believing him to essentially just be a foolish clout chaser, only after Sparta's power, when in reality, he's no different. One of the most interesting aspects about Vergil is how he has this deep intensity and clarity of purpose, but when you actually boil it down, he doesn't really have a purpose at all. All his purpose leads him to is blindly lusting after the nearest and greatest form of power he can attain, regardless of what the actual attainment of that power will do to the world around him. Moving on to his fights, your first fight with him is beautifully cinematic, set atop the tower you've been climbing for the first 7 missions of the game. In the middle of the pouring rain, it sets up the tension and spectacle inherent in the fight between these two characters beautifully. Here, Vergil uses his katana Yamato exclusively, making use of blindingly fast combos and attacks that come in flurries, with pauses in between that you can punish if you time it correctly. This fight is admittedly not the most difficult, but as I said, it's beautifully cinematic, and it mainly acts as a basis to demonstrate Vergil's capabilities to the player, as well as the required tools and skills for beating him. Vergil 2 then builds on this by having you fight him with Beowulf. This gives him an extra burst of maneuverability as his combos become faster and more punishing, as well as acting as a really fun thematic connection between Vergil and Nilo Angelo, as their fights both progress the same way. In the first fight with Vergil and the first fight with Nilo, they're both very simple. They simply use basic sword combos and teleport around the arena a bit. Meanwhile, Vergil 2 and Nilo 2 both introduce close quarters fist attacks that do a shitload of damage. And then, Vergil 3 and Nilo 3 combine all of the skills together you've learned while fighting him, and add fucking summon swords. He also gets access to Devil Trigger at the same time you do, which is a really fun little piece of game design as it feels like you're fighting a true equal. Without getting too far into detail, all of Vergil's fights are incredibly entertaining and incredible spectacle. They all feel fair, with great tells and lots of opportunity to punish him if you have patience. It generally just feels like you're fighting an equal. And that's the main reason why everyone loves these fights. It's so excellent at putting you, the player, in the place of Dante fighting an equal. I don't think, again, that I really even need to say that Vergil is an S-tier design. One of the best designs in gaming, one of the best designed bosses in gaming. Enough said. Finally, our first actually well-designed and well-written Devil May Cry deuteragonist. Lady's design strikes this really fun balance between completely ridiculous and ridiculously cool. Dressed in a white shirt with various ammo packs and grenades slung around her skirt, with starkly contrasting knee-high red boots. As most Devil May Cry 3 characters do, she instantly makes an impression with her fucking bayonet bazooka, because as we all know, redundancy is always cool. Especially if it enables her to pull off some of the most fun choreography in the series so far. It's such an effective design to me because it effectively communicates her two most important character aspects, while making her visually a foil for both Dante and her father. Lady's main trait in this beautiful character square we have going on is being the only character with a completely pure and unadulterated sense of purpose and justice. She wishes to remove her father's evil from the world forever and avenge her mother. The counterbalance for this, though, is that she's just a normal human, with no real power to back her quest for revenge up, which is why she learns to accept Dante's assistance, but also her originally black and white worldview where demons are the goodies and humans are the baddies is broadened by understanding Dante as a devil who faces the same set of struggles she does. It's a really interesting idea to have this sort of holy maiden character explored in this sort of way, as someone with complete purity and intent of purpose, but that is naive about the complexity of the world and her place in it. To complement this, the most striking element of her design is her pure white shirt, a colour that represents her purity and just intent, but this shirt is also crucially part of an almost schoolgirl-like outfit, denoting her youth and naivety. And just like that, boom, in one element of the design you have her two most important traits summed up. But it goes even further, as the other elements of her design relate to aspects of her character, notably the black leather gun belt and red boots that break up the pale tone set by her shirt and skin. Red, as we've established, is used in this series most commonly to denote passion, a la Dante's red coat, Vergil's reddish inner coat lining, and here it is no different, as it demonstrates the fiery passion that drives her towards her revenge. But also, just as Lucia's hair did in Devil May Cry 2, it draws a visual parallel between her and Dante, though this time much less overt, effectively linking our two protagonists together with their complementary colour schemes, and with more actual storytelling backing that up this time, unlike in Devil May Cry 2's case. The next most important role is then played by the gun belt, effectively acting as a barrier between her passion and her purity, or more literally a barrier between your attention being drawn towards the white shirt or red boots, itself drawing your attention to it. Which is important because this is the part of Lady's design which most clearly establishes that she is a walking fucking armory and not to be messed with. A trait which thematically enables her to defeat the demons and climb the tower. Lady is just generally an incredibly fun idea for a character, especially in this game. A normal human driven on a quest for revenge against her demon-summoning demigod dad. She brings that human who continues on, struggling forward in the face of impossible odds vibe that I really appreciate in a character. Her character arc is actually probably the best explicitly put together in the entire game, and her final moment with Arkham is genuinely pretty poignant. Well, as close to being poignant as Devil May Cry gets anyway. One really minor nitpicking critique I do have is her heterochromia. It's a nice character design trait. I get that it indelibly links her with her father, who she wants to separate herself from, but for being the character with the least overt focus and duality in the entire game, it's a bit weird as a design trait, as shown by the fact that the later games seem to completely forget about it. Part of it is so that her father leaves a lasting legacy on her that she can't leave behind, other than, you know, all the fucking trauma, but it does just feel like a very underutilized piece of her design. She separates herself from Dante by using exclusively ranged weapons, showing her support for Devil May Cry 2 fans by proving that gun combat can in fact be cool. It's a fun character detail too, because as she's meant to represent the good in humanity, of course she uses exclusively human-made weapons, rather than relying on those made by demons. Unfortunately, she isn't playable in this game. But oh boy, will we get some of that in 4. However, she does have a boss encounter, and that's where her otherwise excellent design really starts to falter. I get the point. She can't fight Dante head on, she's a normal human. So, of course, her fight revolves around a hit and run style chase where Dante has to physically lock her down in order to land hits. The problem is that in practice this can often be extremely infuriating as she darts around the map taking pot shots at you. Especially because those hit windows become increasingly shorter and shorter on higher difficulties. So even when you eventually lock her down, she just kind of scoots away. That said, the fight isn't nearly as bad as the game's worst lows, and it does make sense for her character. So I'm still perfectly content to give her an S overall. Alright, I'ma say it. Arkham is the most underrated character in the series. He's so fantastically balanced as the ultimate thematic evil in this character square, with 3 other representations of what kinds of people trauma can create. This is just a megalomaniacal, needlessly calculating bastard who causes other people's trauma for the hell of it. I think that part of the problem is that people tend to identify him with his fight, which, yes, I agree, is pretty awful. The idea of having a sort of homogenized slime boss with no clear design, abysmal hitboxes, and minions, which takes your stance system away for the entire second half of the fight, isn't exactly a slam dunk on the dev team's part, but while the actual combat parts of the fight may completely blow ass for a variety of reasons, it's actually thematically kind of amazing. Let me explain why. See, Arkham is the direct opposite of Lady, where she is driven by a righteous sense of purpose to avenge her mother and stop her father. Arkham almost seems to have no purpose, reveling in the acquisition of greater and greater levels of power, as well as the sheer human capacity for sin and evil, encouraging all of the negative aspects of humanity. Effectively, he performed the exact opposite function of a priest, encouraging people to indulge in and love their sins, whatever they may be. and this hedonism is exactly what leads him to sacrifice his own wife in exchange for some level of control over demonic forces. It's ironic then that, exactly like Mundus before him, Arkham cloaks his hedonistic ways behind a mask of religious imagery, except instead of claiming to be a god, he poses as a servant of one, as his plain black priestly attire almost begs you to ignore him. The priest outfit is arguably the best part of his design, as it performs the most vital functions of any piece of it. All at once, it makes him appear more unassuming, contrasts him starkly with Lady's majority white design, hinting at his own hedonistic nature, and establishes this really nice ironic twist with him being a priest of hell instead of your more scary garden variety priest. Villains of the Devil May Cry series shrouding themselves with imagery of the divine is a common theme. This game is fundamentally about rebellion and finding your own purpose, so of course dogmatic religion finds itself on the other end of that scale, as it's effectively being presented as someone telling you what to think and what to feel, rather than defining your own purpose for yourself. It's also interesting that once again, like Dante and Vergil, Lady and Arkham's designs contrast strongly in their level of openness, with Lady revealing a fair amount of skin, whereas Arkham is closed off and restrained, implying that, just like Vergil, he has something to protect and hide. But while Vergil is closed off because of his traumatic past, Arkham seeks to obscure his true self in order to ensure that he's also got some of that lovely, say it with me now, duality theming. Made most obvious with his heterochromia, of course, which is actually made to be an explicit hint to Jester's true identity. I guess they give it to ladies so that you could find it more easy to make that connection. Jester in general is an interesting character, an act that Arkham puts on in order to lure Dante into the right spot in order to weaken him and then gain his demonic power. He states that he was literally playing the fool, which is apt considering that his whole plan falls apart because he forgot how demonic power worked and became an evil fetus rather than great demon knight. Essentially, yeah, Jester is Arkham's true self in all ways, both in terms of his demeanor and in the more meta sense, that Jester is literally just the writers alluding to the fact that Arkham is a fucking clown and doesn't know what he's doing. The reveal that the two are one and the same is really well put together, with cuts seamlessly blending the two together as if they occupy the same space at the same time, rather than having some big transformation sequence, which I really like. It makes Jester feel more like another part of Arkham than a wacky disguise he takes on to fool Dante. His fights are also deliberately mostly made skippable, because just like Arkham, Jester sucks to face. He's just another wait for opportunity while doing nothing, attack, rinse, repeat boss, and they're never much fun. And that's before the fucking ball he gets in his second fight completely breaks his established mechanics and makes him a complete fuck to fight. Anyway, I've gone massively off topic. The boss fight with Arkham sucks dick to fight against, yes. I could spend at least an hour talking about all the ways in which it sucks and how it completely removes any level of enjoyment or skill expression from this fight, or how Vergil being controllable but losing both style and DT is needlessly crippling and makes him almost impossible on Dante must die. But it's very easy to be negative about that fight. Instead, I want to talk about what it does right for his character, because now we have this arrogant and hedonistic servant of hell who fully believes he can just yoink Sparda's power, and who is then reduced to being a completely delusional blob of pulsating raw energy. He took hold of great power without true purpose, and has gained effectively what he wished, but he has had his ability to act in a meaningful way forever removed from him, all the while believing that he's actually achieved his goal, hypnotized by the allure of power he craves more and more of. Thematically, the idea that he wanted to emulate Sparda, a demon knight legendarily skilled in combat, but now that he has all his power, all he can do is uselessly flail around and summon eels to fight for him, is amazing. It really completes the message of the entire game for me. Power without purpose is useless and ultimately self-destructive. He is in many ways the personification of what Devil May Cry identifies a demon as, a being with no purpose or heart that can only take from others and achieve no true end. A parasite. I love this character and his design, and I'm sure in spite of many issues, I'm giving him an A. The enemy designs in this game are, compared to the character and boss designs, a lot more simple. Effectively, they focus largely around the same themes as the first game did, the duality between man and demon and parasitic nature of demons themselves. But they also take a lot more active inspiration from the main inspiration for Devil May Cry in the first place, Dante's Inferno, with one of the main sets of enemies, the Seven Hells, all being based around the Seven Sins. Anyway, without further ado, speaking of the Seven Hells, the Seven Hells are jailers, who are said to rule over and guard souls that have committed one of the 7 deadly sins: pride, lust, wrath, sloth, envy, gluttony, and greed. It's an inherently really fun idea for a basic enemy type, lining up with DMC3's greater focus on human evil and sin in this universe, and the implications of those things, and allowing there to be several palette swaps of the same enemy without making it feel too repetitive, and keeping them kind of fun and fresh. So to start off with, there's Pride. Ironically, the most basic and easily defeated of the enemies, which is just sort of a basic kind of Grim Reaper archetype. I'm not sure why they went this route. I guess it's because they're jailers and they're like reaping the crop of souls. Yeah, I'll go with that one. That actually sounds like an interesting interpretation. Regardless though, the plainness of the design does give the sense of them being punished for being prideful by essentially making them completely indistinguishable from any other kind of soul, which is a really fun idea. They're also the only one of these enemies with a guard stance, which of course, having the prideful souls being the main ones that are actively concerned with self-preservation, is again just a really interesting way to characterize them through gameplay. Envy jailers are parasites that live inside the belly of a great leviathan, literally living in and sustaining themselves on acidic bile. Their scythes are more serrated, denoting the viciousness that can result from envy, but they're also completely emaciated and trapped in various nets and webs, literally being trapped within their own envy and blind to anything else. These designs could use with something to vary them away from the Hell Prides, at least in some aspect of their design I feel, otherwise they are literally just reskins of the exact same enemy from the combat sense, but I don't really think that drags the actual visual design itself down in any meaningful way. Wrath is the most actively annoying of the enemy designs of these. They carry a huge ball of pent-up rage that the player has to detonate from range with their guns in order to defeat them. I'm generally not really a fan of the kamikaze enemy type in any form of game, but they're just an unwelcome annoyance that doesn't really add anything to this game in my opinion. However, the idea that wrathful spirits are forced to forever carry their rage on their back like Atlas for the rest of their lives is metal as fuck, and such an interesting way to represent them. But I do really wish they did more with it, instead of having them just sort of blow up at you. The Gluttony Jailer is arguably the worst offender, because nothing about it is particularly gluttony themed, apart from the fact that it throws up sand at you. Outside of that, it's kind of just a regular Hell Pride with a staff instead of a scythe. I don't know, this one really just doesn't jive with me. I feel like there were much better ways to address the sin of gluttony than just yellow Hell Pride that spits sand at you. Lust is a bit better, dressed in these luxurious clothes, with no hood, I guess symbolizing its unabashed and deviant nature. Their gimmick is being more agile and dashing at you, which can get really grating on higher difficulties because of their ability to just walk around all of your strikes and then hit you for a quarter of your health. Breaking the stinky streak though, the Health Sloth is a really fun design. Covered in bandages that cover its body and eyes, the Hell Sloths teleport around the arena instead of simply walking, and have a fittingly lazy swing at whatever's in front of them. Imagine being so monumentally lazy that Hell's chosen way to punish you is just by giving you a free teleport, so you really have no excuse for doing nothing. The entire enemy, both in terms of visuals with the bandages covering, restricting it, to the way it moves and fights, is just perfectly designed to create this feeling of absolute lethargy about it, and I love that. Finally, Greed refuses to fight you directly, and uses its fucking Iron Maiden / power generator to summon backup dancers to fight for him. Currently unaware how the Seven Hells sand economy works, but this guy is definitely at the top of it. Also really interesting to me is the fact that these guys wear thieves' hoods. Literally, people who were thieves of various kinds in life are forever chained to their wealth and forced to use it to summon others to protect them. Just a really fun and creative punishment fits the crime design, and one that contributes in an interesting way to the overall combat loop, forcing the player to make strategic decisions on taking them out versus the other enemies that have spawned with them. Overall, the Seven Hells are a mixed bag of both good and bad designs. They don't all succeed in being unique, but when they are some of the most thematically rich and fun to fight enemies Devil May Cry has to offer. So, A tier. Enigma are the second enemy type you encounter in Devil May Cry 3, and they're just sort of there. There's this running theme within DMC3 of demonic forces taking possession of statues of varying types, using stone facades to appear more powerful than they actually are, which lines up with Devil May Cry 1's approach, both in terms of demons only being able to manifest via possession, and using stone facades to conceal their true weakness, a la Mundus. Enigma is by far the weakest of these from a design perspective though. It's very difficult to tell immediately what it is when you look at it, which I guess fits the whole Enigma thing, but I don't really mean this in a good way. The entire design just generally feels sort of purposeless beyond being random stone sticky outy bits with some eyes stuck on it, and it doesn't really feel like it's doing anything beyond that. To continue with the whole demons are cowards hiding behind stone facades thing, Enigma will only fire arrows at Dante from range, blue arrows which can be cancelled by hitting it, and red which can't. They're inoffensive on lower difficulties but don't really add anything to combat other than having to keep an ear out for their audio cue, but on higher difficulties their arrows absolutely shred your health, and to top it they're always unstoppable. They're placed very annoyingly in some arenas and generally just not very fun to fight, I think. They're just a decent concept for an enemy, muddled by what I think is kind of poor execution and one-dimensional game design. C tier. The damned chessmen. Ordinarily, I'd be compelled to go through each of these in detail, but there's not honestly a tremendous amount to say about them. Each one of them is just sort of chess piece plus vaguely demonic elements equals design, and while you could argue they're not really trying to do anything different, they're all just a bit boring to look at in my opinion. Granted, they do continue the whole stone facade theme I mentioned with Enigma, but they do it even worse by not really having any sort of weaker second form or obviously biological elements. Something like mutated mounds of flesh or demonic spectral arms erupting from each piece would add a badly needed piece of personality to their designs, rather than just having them read as bland stone automatons. In terms of game design, they act as normal chess pieces do, with attacks based around that chess piece's actions. Pawns move slowly forward and attack diagonally, and knights move in L shapes and jump in the air, etc. This is a fun idea for an enemy set, but every time they show up prior to the actual chessboard sequence, they feel very one-dimensional and lacking in challenge, because you can already predict exactly what they'll do. Their significant health bars and lack of movement, except in the knights, means that oftentimes you just end up sitting still and wailing on one piece and waiting for it to die, which grinds combat to a complete halt. When you do come to the chessboard fight, more interesting mechanics like the rook being able to swap places with the king, and pawns being able to emote do get introduced, but on the higher difficulties these mechanics just become a sort of unnecessary annoyance, as the chess pieces really don't seem designed to interact with each other in this way. The result is honestly just an overwhelming barrage of attacks that Dante isn't really equipped to deal with, which just results in you effectively having to charge at the king and attempt to kill him before you get squashed, which, yeah, unsurprisingly isn't very fun. These enemies are just generally severely lacking in visual or combat depth, and the game would be much better without them. D tier. Blood Goyles, meanwhile, are a much more interesting design iteration of this same idea, demons using a stone facade to hide their true nature, as they are demonic gargoyles that can transform into this blood form that Dante can't defeat with his melee weapons. Immediately, this is more interesting than the chessmen because Unlike chess, gargoyles actually have a traditional connection to the demonic, specifically being used to ward off evil spirits and prevent them from entering or assailing those in buildings under their protection. This is interesting, as it demonstrates that not even inanimate stone guardians are uncorruptible to the demons, with their seemingly absolute power, which presents an almost Vergil-like view of the world. The only thing you can trust to protect you is yourself. It also runs parallel with the ideas of the biblical being used as a protective mask for the demonic. All strong elements, combined with its immaterial nature as a construct of blood that only splits into more of itself when struck, which makes it seem insurmountable. However, counter to this perceived sense of absolute and unassailable power, the blood goyle is also fundamentally a parasitic organism, having to take the form of existing gargoyles in order to manifest, the same underlying weakness as many of DMC's best demon designs. It can also be forced back into the stone form by human-made ranged weapons like guns, although the actual lore for this is kind of dumb, once again proving what a hollow lie that demonic power is. Very ironic then that Arkham is the one to summon them, the character most obsessed with that hollow demonic power for its own sake. In terms of gameplay design, yeah, you already know I don't really have anything good to say, being only able to defeat them in the least engaging and most time-consuming way present in Dante's kit does not an entertaining fight make, and so yeah, they suck in almost every arena they're placed in, especially considering the fact that they can fly too high for your camera to follow them properly, so you're just shooting blindly into the sky most of the time, Griffin 3 style. It's even more frustrating because of their ability to split in half when struck, meaning if you're hitting an enemy and they happen to wander in range of your attacks, then lol, one more goyle to deal with. Generally a good visual design spoiled by some very unfortunate gameplay. High C tier. Arachne are the souls of women, killed and sent to the underworld, transformed into horrific spider-human mutant hybrids and set upon Dante. Except kinda not really. They're definitively more spider than human, to the point where honestly they'd have just been better off being giant spiders, and the inherent cool factor of a damned human soul being mutated into an animal form is nearly completely squandered. Even just the inclusion of something like a head of silky white hair to more clearly identify them with what they're actually supposed to narratively be would massively improve them. The game in general really suffers in creating interesting humans mutated into devils designs, and these are just one symptom of that. The one part of their design that does present something interesting is the choice of name. Arachne was a weaver in Greek mythology who challenged the goddess Athena to a weaving competition, because she believed she was the better weaver. She was able to easily beat Athena, who saw this as an act of immense hubris and transformed her into a spider. This idea of arrogance and a desire to prove one's abilities being the precursor to someone's downfall is one that is replicated within the game with characters like Arkham. I really wish this design explored that idea more. As it is, they're just kind of basic, frustrating spider enemies, and they're no more fun to fight, with a wide array of capabilities that allow them to outright avoid or ignore most of Dante's kit, while trapping and stun-locking him into being hit a billion times. So beating them once again requires precise timing, which would be skill expressive if it led to any real opportunity to deal damage to the Arachne afterwards. Instead, you might well just get blocked at point blank range and then get whacked. Generally not very fun enemies, and one of the many which feel frustratingly anti-player. That, in addition to a frustratingly design, leads me to a D tier. Continuing the trend of enemies with interesting mythological inspirations, but with lackluster designs that don't really live up to that concept, the Dullahan is far and away one of DMC's worst enemies. The Dullahan itself is a spirit from Irish folklore, essentially a headless horseman that calls out the names of those destined to die. It's a really fucking spooky creature, one that has a lot of potential to be turned into a fucking baller DMC design, with the idea of separation between two binary aspects, mind and body, already there for you to explore. So, how does DMC3 handle it? Well, its lore at least is kinda cool, being the possessed husk of a once proud demon knight being piloted around by a parasitic lesser demon, once again revisiting the patheticness of demons, disregarding any form of morality or honor in order to gain as much power as possible, as easily as possible. And this again is interesting, it links in with the fact that Arkham is essentially trying to do the same thing. Unfortunately, all of these really fun theoretical aspects barely transfer over into the visual or gameplay design itself. In-game, it's a big lion head emblazoned on a shield with a smaller body following along behind, and a giant Resident Evil style big glowy hit spot, which is the only place it takes damage in. It doesn't even look like some kind of uncanny corpse being piloted, just a weird, very clean automaton like one of the chessmen, complete with a fucking buzzsaw shield. It just looks far too clean, and beyond that, too plain to live up to the concept of what it's actually supposed to be. Topping that off, it's used more as a passive arena hazard than an active enemy in the encounters that feature it, as it just sort of hovers at you and attempts to catch you in its spinning blades while you wait to jump behind it, and Helmbreaker the glaringly obvious weak spot. Little to no skill is required to actually beat it, just patience, which slows down the actual pace of combat and fights with it to a crawl. D tier for you, bitch. Soul Eaters are one of the strangest looking and most inexplicably designed enemies in Devil May Cry 3. They're supposedly these parasitic, soul-sucking monstrosities from the pits of hell, and they definitely look the part, being the good kind of eerie, I can't tell what the fuck I'm looking at design that has no clear features apart from a pair of piercing eyes. But equally, because the design is so simple and nondescript, it leaves me with very little to actually say about it. Beyond, yeah, it's pretty competent at being what it is. The idea of the demon switching from a corporeal to gaseous state is fun in concept and leads into the idea that even these powerful demons are ultimately formless. But it contributes to one of the most actively annoying game mechanics in the entire game. When the Soul Eaters think your back is turned, they're corporeal, and then when you face them head on, they transform into their unhittable gaseous form. This makes sense thematically, of course, they don't want to fight you head on, but it makes one of the most annoying things possible in practice, and actively discourages engagement with the enemy in any normal way beyond turning away and then blasting them with a single shotgun blast. A method which becomes especially annoying to manage when these enemies get mixed in with others and you can't deal with them properly because of the game's lock-on system, giving them ample time to wander up behind you and do their annoying-ass one-shot grab that you can only break out of with Devil Trigger, effectively mixing together all of the most annoying enemy traits possible into a complete lump of shit. D tier. The Fallen are definitely my favourite minor enemy visual design in the entire game. They're an encapsulation of DMC's entire philosophy. Demons who fell from grace after deceiving and killing their victims, the Fallen take on the form of angelic figures who shroud themselves in snow-white wings, concealing their true monstrous body. The lore implications of these being actual biblical fallen angels are fascinating to begin with, and their design works really well with others like Mundus in the vein of the demons using divinity as a mask to hide their true intentions. Like with Mundus's very obviously corrupted heart, even in their disguised form, a false demonic head can be seen peering out above the Fallen's wing cloak, demonstrating their true nature even to those that they're trying to deceive. But they rely on their halos, javelins of light, and pure white wings to trick humans into believing that they're staring down a divine entity. While in this shrouded state, they are invulnerable and can pass through walls, as if they can trick reality around them into obeying their rules. It's also a really interesting touch that the wings aren't actually remotely used for flying, just solely for concealing their true nature, which demonstrates the depth of the deception, as well as how their power prevents them from achieving any meaningful form of freedom, as flying is a very common symbol of freedom. The idea of their true body also being this monstrous, demonic maw is also a really strong choice, having them literally be two-faced, which also serves to make the transition between angelic visage and demonic hellspawn even more apparent. Generally, just an insanely strong design, and I wish Devil May Cry experimented more with transitioning angelic designs into corrupted demons. However, their gameplay really drags them down because as I've mentioned, they have this ability to phase through walls and are invulnerable until their angelic shield is broken, which is already annoying because half of the time you can't actually fight them without waiting for them to come to you, and their shield gimmick also completely de-incentivizes combo attacks in favor of spamming the same basic combination because it's genuinely more efficient. They're a bad gameplay design because they feel specifically designed to annoy and harass the player rather than being an actually engaging part of the combat loop. Honestly, even just removing their ability to phase through walls would make them so much more tolerable to fight against. An S visually and a D in gameplay makes a B overall, I think. Abyss are the final and strongest minor enemy in Devil May Cry 3, and kind of interestingly, they're a demonic compilation of the 7 sins, bringing together the attacks and abilities of each of the major Hell Jailers to create one powerful entity. Essentially a demonic reflection of human sin. It's one of the most traditional devil designs in Devil May Cry, with the heavy use of red and big pointy horns, but that honestly just works in its favour in my opinion. Just like most of the more powerful demons, despite at first appearing solid, it's a creature entirely composed of constantly shifting blood. Much like the Hell Jailers, it's actually a completely insubstantial entity, reflecting the insubstantive nature of demonic power, and how it erodes away at a corporeal form. In terms of gameplay, they're a rarity in Devil May Cry 3 in that actually they're pretty fun to fight, with a wide variety of attacks that all have very specific tells, and the free ability to combo them if you time it properly, whilst also actively testing all the skills the player learned whilst fighting the Hell Jailers. Its only really frustrating ability is the phasing into the ground, which can be really grating if you're just trying to whack it and it disappears on you, but outside of that, it's just generally a good addition to the cast. Solid gameplay design and an initially bland visual design that actually has a lot of fun elements to it below the surface. Solid A from me. Hell Vanguard is Devil May Cry 3's tutorial boss, which later becomes a sort of mini-boss enemy that appears periodically around the tower, often when least wanted. Visually, it's just sort of a larger version of the Hell Pride, with these guys being said to be the actual Grim Reapers of the Devil May Cry universe, which is a shame because they're literally just the most basic stock Grim Reaper design you can get, and nothing about their design is really thematically that interesting. Their long and flowing cloaks do have the effect of completely masking their main body most of the time, which makes them look fittingly ephemeral, going with the whole despite their claim to power they lack concrete physical form thing. But beyond that, they're just not really that interesting. They also don't really win the award for best or worst gameplay either, since they do have a range of attacks and don't have any silly ranged weapon only gimmick like most of Devil May Cry's other enemies, but what they do have is a lot of very fast teleporting, which does not jive well with this game's very antiquated lock-on system. Its attacks, while they do have decently fair tells, also have a very weird dodge timings and could be frustrating in concert with other enemies because of their speed. Its cloak can also block out the camera in more crowded arenas, so fighting it can easily become a nightmare if it positions itself in the worst place possible. But honestly, I find myself struggling for things to say about him either way. He's an unusually bland design in a series where usually I have something strong to say one way or another. C grade. Cerberus in Greek mythology is the guardian of the underworld, a monstrous three-headed dog who guards its gates, preventing entry or exit to those who seek it. It actually appears in the Divine Comedy, presiding over those who have committed the sin of gluttony in the third circle of hell, in a realm of icy rain and mud, which likely provided the inspiration for the ice-themed version of Cerberus used in the game. The first major interesting step this version of Cerberus takes is clearly differentiating the three heads, with completely different head shapes and unique attacks for each one. The red-eyed head makes use of an ice beam and has a traditionally wolf-like head structure, with prominent yellowed fangs. The yellow-eyed head summons a rain of icicles and more closely resembles a hunting hound, and the blue-eyed head belches blasts of ice, and is harder to identify, somewhere between German Shepherd and outright Berserk reference. The separation and characterization of these three heads is Cerberus' strongest design point, both visually and gameplay-wise, as the three heads seeming to come from completely separate species makes Cerberus feel like this really interesting chimera of different canine forms, which I think is a really fun way actually to characterize its various roles both as a guard dog and a vicious predator. as well as expressing the mutating nature of demonic power. Cerberus's fight also significantly benefits from this decision, as each head has a separate health bar, allowing the player to strategically eliminate the primary heads they have the most trouble dealing with, or simply keep them all equal health and defeat them in one fell swoop with a DT explosion. Cerberus generally places great focus on variation of approach, as there are several different ways to approach the fight that are completely valid, and even a temporary damage avoidance gimmick that actually works, in the form of the ice that the player has to periodically blast off of him, simply because it's a very easy gimmick to deal with, and it requires the player to remain on the offensive and keeps them on their toes. Generally, outside of some minor issues with it constantly spamming the same head attack and its hitboxes, I'd say this is easily a contender for being one of the best non-Vergil bosses in the entire game. Definitely the series' best first boss, simply because of the variation and freedom of approaches it allows the player to explore through its design. Its main problem is just that I think that it could absolutely stand to go harder on the chimeric aspect and differentiate the three heads even further. Maybe start playing around with the actual shape of the body itself. Although I will accept that most of Cerberus's body being covered up and hidden away from the player is kind of the point. The game wants you to focus on the three heads and their differences from each other. Outside of that though, it's a very strong design and likely contributed to people falling in love with this game to begin with. A grade. What the fuck even is Gigapede? Like actually, why would you come off such a strong opening boss and be like, ah yes, now it's time to give a floating centipede that lobs lightning down at the player while never interacting with them, and that you could beat as soon as you climb on top of it on most difficulties. Do you want to know what this is? It's a Time Rift opening tapeworm, and it's about as much fun as that sounds. Like, I'm really trying to find anything interesting to say about it except a constant stream of complaints and confusion, but there really isn't anything. It feels like a DMC2 enemy that escaped captivity and made it into this game. But at least with some of those I had something interesting to say about the design beyond the most basic. It's a parasite, so it works with the demon's parasitic nature, and its mutated size demonstrates the mutating effects of demonic power. There we go. Its boss design is genuinely on the same tier as Infested Chopper, although admittedly you can actually hit it. It's just such a weird boss in that it punishes the player for interacting with it in a certain way, whilst giving them no other real combat options against it. Just generally an incredibly frustrating piece of shit boss. Tapeworm tier. And we're right back onto top DMC form with Agni and Rudra, the actual best duo fight. Suck it, Ornstein and Smile. Unlike most demons who simply forfeit their power to Dante in the form of devil arms, Agni and Rudra are actually devil arms possessing bodies. Their names are references to the Hindu gods Agni and Rudra, gods of fire and storm respectively, combined with a little bit of Japanese mythology in their bodies taking forms resembling the blue and red ogres from Japanese mythology. However, this aspect is only skin deep, at least where it concerns their characterization. Meanwhile, references to the Hindu gods works as a little hint to their status as two entities and destructive forces that are mirror images of each other, as both gods are said to be aspects of the Hindu god Shiva. It's also a nice little analogue for the other pair of brothers defined by the colours red and blue. Powerful forces of destruction when apart that reach their greatest level of power when working together. But the strength of the design goes beyond just being a cool metaphor for Dante and Vergil's journey, as their nature as weapons, who are actually separate constructs from their bodies, is actually a really interesting examination of the series' representations of demonic power. See, these two aren't exactly a parasitic existence that subsists off of possessing an existing object like other demons, but they are still bound to be tools without an actual true body of their own. The idea being that power is only a tool that must be wielded in the correct way, and the harmony of the two brothers is actually one of the most positive representations of pure demonic power we get in the series. The actual boss fight itself should be incredibly obnoxious. A fast-paced fight versus two speedy combatants with AoE attacks should be an absolute nightmare. The fact that it's not is a strong testament to DMC3's stellar sound design and attack tells. Each one is fair and differentiated from the others enough that if you're patient you can juggle, keeping an eye on both bosses while finding several attack windows to attack them from many angles. The two brothers are almost never in perfect sync, which makes their attacks far easier to deal with once you learn the timings, and both fire and wind have their own unique set of exploitable weaknesses. They can even be tricked into hitting and stunning each other, which is their main exploitable weakness on higher difficulties, which adds such a fun strategic layer to your fights with them, judging when it's best to attack them yourself versus letting the brothers deal damage to one another. When one brother is beaten, they then get access to this hyper-strong dual blade form that can be a real pain to deal with though, so it's encouraged for you to balance hitting both brothers equally, which I actually appreciate as an extra layer of strategy to the fight. Overall, a really fun boss concept with strong thematic links to the story, well executed with an actually fair 2v1 boss fight. Definitely worthy of an S grade. Leviathan is a gigantic whale-like demon, unsealed by Arkham and Vergil to guard the tower. It's a sort of hodgepodge of different biblical references mixed together, referencing the biblical creature of the same name and the story of Jonah. Leviathan is an unkillable serpent created by God and shown in the book of Job, said to be slain at the end of time so that the righteous may feast on its corpse, and is identified with the sin of envy, as it is in the game. However, the beast's designer, Daigo Ikeno, was told specifically to veer away from making it look like a dragon, as the biblical Leviathan does, which, combined with its swallowing of Dante, makes me think of the story of Jonah, a prophet who was swallowed by a great whale, essentially for attempting to berate God and escape his plans for him. This is actually interesting with respect to Dante's character, as just before he is swallowed, he was busy shirking his own responsibility to Sparta's legacy, just as Jonah defied his responsibility to God. As such, both are swallowed by a great whale, but where Jonah is a hapless passenger inside the whale, and Dante fights his way out to go stop Vergil again. It also, like the Cerberus, is kind of a chimera, incorporating multiple different animal elements between the whale, giant fish, and more serpent-like elements that come from its various influences. The actual boss fight with it comes in the form of Dante beating the ever-loving shit out of its heart, a concept that sounds way cooler than the execution, which just involves you diving between hitting two lungs on either side of a room, while enemies constantly spawn and you have to dodge lasers, and then you hit those lungs until you reveal the boss's true hidden core. As always, bosses that you don't have to interact with are loads of fun, and I'm so happy that this series keeps doing them over and over again, despite the fact that they always suck. It's effectively just a normal enemy encounter with a really annoying stage hazard in the back, which is just no fun, and the level that precedes the fight, where you crawl through its gut, even commits the mortal sin of bringing Gigapede back. To end on a good note, At Least the Heart takes a very obvious nod to Nightmare's design from the first game, which is a fun little Easter egg revealing that Leviathan is also actually a creation of Mundus, which is fun, meaning that Dante is punished for not taking up his father's legacy by being swallowed up by the creation of his father's greatest enemy. Cool thematics, awful boss. Low B tier. Returning back to the theme of creatures inspired by Irish mythology, there's good old Nevin. She's a demon stated to seduce humans down a dark path of excess and sin, sealed away by Sparta to protect the human realm, and yup, she fits that role perfectly. Appearing as a pretty typical temptress designed character with long flowing dress and hair, only barely censoring the bits that need censored. But there's something not quite right about her. The slightly green-tinged skin and snake-like eyes poke very obvious holes in this facade. She attempts to tempt Dante, but because luckily he doesn't know what women are, he fights and forces her to become his electric guitar sight. She does also keep the chimeric aspect of the other beast bosses by being able to transform into a swarm of bats that she also uses to conduct her electrical shocks. Thematically, she's a representation of Dante denying temptation. The idea of her being able to transform into this swarm of evil bats is also a really neat nod to the fact that she's kind of based on Alina and Sheev. Apologies if I've butchered that. In terms of gameplay design, she's my favourite non-Vergil fight, and I might actually even prefer her to Vergil too. Shock horror, I know. Which comes as an extra surprise because she's one of those gimmick fights I've made a point to dislike up until now. But she actually works because the central damage avoidance mechanic she possesses is A, capable of being dealt with in a multitude of ways, and B, can't really be trivialized and completely avoided once you know all about it. Essentially, her bats act as the shield, and they have to be dispelled by dealing any form of damage before she can be actually struck. You either do this with the guns, which takes a longer time but is more reliable, or wait for the right opportunity to do it in melee, an action which you can punish if you don't time it right. You can't really trivialize this mechanic in any major way even with DT burst, as that's better used in her vulnerable state anyway to do as much damage as possible. To top it all off, she has arguably the most fair set of attack tells in the game, and I can't really fault many of her hitboxes either. She's a boss that can be overcome with enough patience, but isn't trivialized once you know how to beat it, which is my absolute favourite kind. The task that stays rewarding no matter how many times you take it. Her one major issue is her grab attack state, where her normal rhythm is disrupted and she lunges at you in what's supposed to be her vulnerable state for a powerful grab attack. However, there are ways to deal with this, it's just an annoying gameplay shift to get your head around. Solid S grade for the boss alone, but the design definitely doesn't let it down either. Beowulf is a demon with command over light, which is ironically the most chimeric and bestial of any of the bosses Dante has fought so far. Once again alluding to the fact that demons use impressive fronts of apparently holy power to make themselves appear grand, when they are in this case a horrifying mutated abomination. He's named for the great hero of Saxon myth, Beowulf, which I believe is meant to add to that same sense of a mask of impressive power to cover mutation. He's also the most bitter and actively vindictive of the demons Dante faces, charging after him in a zealous fury in order to get revenge on Sparta for betraying the demons. This interesting contradiction between apparent holy power and his true demonic nature is also explored through the elements Beowulf's design takes from the Mesopotamian wind demon Pazuzu, a destructive entity that was also said to be effective at warding off other demons if pacified. This links back in with this character's visceral hatred towards the demon Sparta and his heirs, as despite being a powerful destructive entity, it seems that it's only other demons he's interested in defeating. Overall, it's a pretty cohesive visual design that both looks cool and has some engaging thematic elements, but something about it just doesn't subjectively click for me though. I think I'd prefer it if something about him was more outwardly holy. Like he was wearing armor that was attempting to hide his true demonic nature, but that broke over the course of the fight, allowing him to use more of his different animal parts for attacks. Honestly, that's a piece of variety I think this fight could use badly as well. It's serviceable, but there's nothing really special about it mechanically in my opinion. It just requires patience and learning his well-telegraphed attack patterns. Do that and he'll almost never hit you. I don't know, this fight just started to feel like a bit of chore to me on higher difficulties, but I'd be interested to know if this is just my subjective experience. Overall, it's a boss that's just baseline pretty competent, that has room to improve, but that doesn't really drag the cast down either. B tier. Geryon is a big scary ghost horse pulling a carriage that shoots fucking missiles at you. Yeah, it's certainly a strange one, but a fun design taking heavy inspiration from Irish myths of the Black Coach, usually drawn by a Dullahan, which announces the names of those who are next to die. It's named for a demon in the Divine Comedy that ironically Vergil actually protects Dante from by blocking the jabs of its stinging tail. Thematically though, its design isn't really about all that much. I guess you could argue it's a personification of finality and death, meant to teach Dante both literally and physically to avoid wasting his time in rebellion against nothing. But nothing about it really feels like it's explicitly saying that. It feels like I'm making a bit of a reach there. I think part of it is that because in some ways its design feels somewhat subdued. It's wacky but in a very basic way, especially when compared to entries like Cerberus or Nevin or Agni and Rudra. After all, it's literally just a big spooky horse and carriage and that's it. Series designer Daigo Ikeno apparently did want to add haunted souls to the back that acted as passengers, which would have been a really cool touch that would have added an amount of visual flair to spice up the design. In terms of gameplay, there's not much to say. The first phase is actively frustrating and just not very fun, as it relies heavily on the guns. The second phase changes it up from you dodging Geryon to actively chasing it around a gladiatorial arena, while it throws various missiles back at you, with you also having to dodge these weird time stop bubbles that allow Geryon to free hit you when you're not careful. Much like the actual design itself, the ideas presented within the fight are cool, but they really falter in execution, with Geryon's hitboxes, time stop mechanic and relatively large health bar all making him a deeply annoying opponent to face. Solid C tier overall. Doppelganger is the non-Vergil boss that has arguably the most impact on Dante's development over the course of the game. As the name suggests, it's a demon comprised of shadow that takes the form of its attacker, and can only be defeated by trapping it using the lamps found in its area. It's very obviously supposed to be a dark reflection of Dante, mimicking his Devil Trigger form with a sinister grin, whilst radiating demonic power. But it's also an important character moment for him. The reflection shows himself if he can't master and discipline his power, turning it towards something actually useful. The entire game has these really powerful thematics about the proper use of power, with Arkham and Vergil both simply craving power with no true reason or purpose why, though in different ways. Dante begins the game completely aimless, a drifter with no understanding of himself or his purpose beyond beating up demons. The fight with Doppelganger shows what that leads to, someone consumed by power with no proper use for it, but that is easily defeated once the weakness in that power is found. The actual boss design is one of the few puzzle designs in the series that I actually like. You have to evade his immortal shadow form while attempting to open up the lamps around the arena by hitting them, mainly because Doppelganger's attacks are very predictable without too much variation, so it's far from the hardest thing to just avoid all this shit and whack the lights. So much so that if anything he's a bit too much of a breeze on lower difficulties. On Dante Must Die though, he can be a real pain because of the lamp shutters scaling with difficulty, making it more difficult to open them. But even then, I still think he's far from being unfair. In fact, what I like about this boss fight is that it essentially forces you into this really high stakes rhythm game, where you have to keep hitting these lights at the same rhythm, otherwise Doppelganger will just close them again. In general, he's got some strong storytelling and thematic properties, and is a relatively fun fight. I think he's a low A tier. So, yeah. Those were my thoughts on this game's roster. It's got hands down the best character design in the entire series, and the characters are at their most thematically resonant and deeply written here. I know it can be a bit easy to dismiss Devil May Cry as funny romp action game where wacky woohoo pizza man fights "show me your motivation." And in a lot of ways it is exactly that, but there's a surprising amount of genuine depth to the ideas that the game explores, despite its faults. And I think it's sort of a shame those aspects aren't more readily appreciated. All of the main characters seek some form of freedom, as Dante and Vergil both follow different paths because of the trauma of losing their mother. Dante seeks freedom through rebellion and casting away Sparda's legacy in order to forget, and Vergil implodes with his own self-loathing driving him to acquire greater and greater levels of power. Lady focuses herself onto a single purpose, the elimination of Arkham, but becomes blind to everything outside of that, even her own physical limitations. Finally, Arkham seeks the freedom to do as he pleases without punishment, ultimate power purely for the sake of it. The characters who desire nothing but power are then punished either through their own death, like with Arkham, or through the loss of their identity and free will, like with Vergil. Meanwhile, Lady and Dante both meaningfully learn and grow from their faults. Unlike both Lucia and Trish, who both just magically became different people after knowing Dante for 5 minutes, Lady actually meaningfully helps Dante and he helps her in turn. Not only that, but the game also manages to make the loss of both villains sincerely tragic, even Arkham, as after killing him, Lady is overcome with emotion after comprehending the true weight of what she's done, because despite everything he'd done, Arkham was still her father. It's so good. The enemy design sort of helped to support these themes, exploring ideas of human sin, the duplicitous nature of devils, human corruption, etc. Essentially the themes that the series' enemy designs have explored from the very beginning, but honestly they feel a little conservative in that approach. Particularly the sins and chessmen just feel like groups of enemies with slight variations on a simple design concept taped together. Meanwhile, the enemy designs that are the most unfun to fight are actually the most uniquely designed, and somewhat relate back to the themes of the individual game, rather than just the series as a whole. Meaning essentially that I don't really have any strong feelings towards any of the enemy designs. As for the bosses, they're a real mixed bag of some absolute bangers and then some DMC2 level garbage. But a uniting problem I find they all have is that while in some aspects they relate really strongly to the overall series, it doesn't really feel like the majority of them are really examining the themes of the game itself in any major way, at least for the most part. leading to what I feel is somewhat of a thematic disconnect between the story the game is presenting and the actual boss designs. Overall though, DMC3's designs are highly underrated, and I feel that though I've heard people sing the praises of Vergil and Dante as the series headliners, there's not enough praise for the equally wonderful designs this game has to offer, like Agni and Rudra, Lady, Arkham, Nevin, and others. I hope this video was fun. It took a million years to script and ended up being really fucking long, and even then I don't really feel that I was able to get my full opinion across in some areas the most clearly, just because in some places there was so much to say. I know it's been a while since my last upload, but I'd like to focus on making longer and more qualitative uploads for you guys to enjoy, even if it takes more time. Well, that's kinda all I have to say, as always. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next hour-long diatribe.